Every country the Iran war is pushing into debt crisis, explained in 14 minutes. There is a war in the Middle East. You already know this. What you may not know is that the war has a secondary casualty list. Countries that had nothing to do with the conflict cannot afford to pay for it, and are now standing at a window in Washington, D.C., watching the IMF decide their fate. This is an episode about that list. The mechanism is simple enough to explain in one sentence. A war closed the world's most important oil choke point. Oil got expensive. Countries that import oil and already owed more than they could comfortably repay are now doing math that doesn't work. The result is a queue. Some countries are already in it. Others are approaching. A few are pretending they're not. We're going to go through them, one by one calmly, as though nothing catastrophic is happening, because that is the register in which this channel operates. The Strait of Hormuz closure. Here is the part that is easy to understate. Brent crude oil surpassed $100 per barrel on March 8, 2026, for the first time in 4 years, rising to $126 per barrel at its peak. The largest monthly increase in oil prices in recorded history occurred in March 2026. The closure of the strait has been characterized as the largest disruption to world energy supply since the 1970s energy crisis. The 1970s comparison is not alarmist. It is the benchmark the analysts themselves are using. Today's shock echoes the 2022 commodity price surge following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which helped push global inflation to its highest since the 1970s. The difference is that in 2022, the world had just come out of a pandemic with elevated liquidity. Central banks had tools. Governments had fiscal room. In an adverse scenario, assuming a sharper increase in energy prices coupled with rising inflation expectations and some tightening of financial conditions, global growth falls to 2.5% this year and inflation rises to 5.4%. In a severe scenario where energy supply dislocations extend into next year, global growth would decline to 2% this year and next, while inflation would exceed 6%. Here's the part nobody mentions. The Hormuz closure transmits directly into food prices. Food price increases are estimated at plus 2.7%, anchored by the cascade from energy through fertilizers to food. Over 30% of global urea, widely used in fertilizer production, is exported from Gulf countries through the strait. Much of the cost of producing corn and wheat is the cost of fertilizer. So the war didn't just disrupt oil. It disrupted the input cost of the food that poorer countries import to feed people. The bill arrives twice. Pakistan. Pakistan is a country that has been operating as a financial tightrope act for several years. The tightrope just got narrower. Pakistan's economic challenges have intensified sharply as rising global oil prices and mounting external debt pressures push the country closer to a financial tipping point. The United Arab Emirates has demanded full repayment of a $3 billion loan extended to Pakistan, the first time in 7 years that Abu Dhabi has refused to roll over or extend the repayment deadline. Pakistan's finance minister acknowledged this publicly at the IMF World Bank spring meetings in Washington. He flew to Washington to manage the situation. The situation was not fully manageable. Higher energy costs are increasing import bills and adding further strain to Pakistan's fragile economy. Analysts warn that Pakistan now faces a difficult balancing act, repaying existing debts while taking on new, potentially more expensive borrowing. Here's the part nobody mentions. Pakistan already had an active IMF program before the war. The war did not create Pakistan's debt problem. It found it and applied pressure exactly where the structure was weakest. The shift in bond spreads has been particularly stark for low-income and lower-middle-income fossil fuel importers that were already vulnerable, such as Sri Lanka and Pakistan, who have current IMF agreements. Bond spreads widen when markets price in the probability that a country won't repay. Think of it as a credit score in real time, broadcast globally. The score dropped. Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka defaulted on its international debt in 2022. It was catastrophic. Fuel ran out. Cooking gas vanished. The president fled the country. Sri Lanka suspended repayment of approximately $7 billion of foreign debt that was due in 2022. That crisis had been building for years. Foreign reserves depleted, tourism wrecked by the pandemic, fertilizer imports abruptly cut in an ill-timed experiment with organic farming that halved crop yields. Sri Lanka spent the next 3 years trying to rebuild. It announced a debt overhaul plan and has continued to make progress. But the parties continue to spar over how much of a hit domestic banks and investors in state-owned enterprises should take. The next tranche of its $2.9 billion IMF bailout package could be delayed over a potential government revenue shortfall. Then, the Iran war happened. Bond spreads have widened particularly sharply for Sri Lanka, a low-income fossil fuel importer that was already vulnerable and has a current IMF agreement. Here's the part nobody mentions. Sri Lanka was already operating without margin. The recovery plan depended on consistent revenue, stable energy costs, and continued access to external financing. All 3 assumptions were disrupted simultaneously, not by anything Sri Lanka did, but by a conflict 4,000 kilometers away in which Sri Lanka had no involvement and no leverage whatsoever. The recovery is now slower. The math is more difficult. The population that had just started to stabilize is looking at higher fuel and food prices again. Egypt. Egypt is the largest Arab country by population, a major importer of wheat and energy, and a country that has been on IMF programs in various forms for years. The IMF downgraded Egypt's growth forecast for 2026 to 4.2%, a downward revision of 0.5 percentage points. Higher oil prices are going to reduce real income, dampen consumption, and the uncertainty is affecting investment. Egypt is also a major recipient of remittances from workers in the Gulf. Remittances will fall in countries that supply migrant workers to the region. Egyptian workers in Gulf states are among the largest remittance-sending communities in the Arab world. Those workers are affected by the economic disruption in Gulf countries. Some have lost work. The money they send home is reduced. Egypt pays for oil imports in dollars. Its reserves are limited. The physical oil market shows dated Brent, the price Asian and MENA importers pay for actual delivered crude, standing at $132 per barrel. Egypt is paying close to that price. It is not the price on financial news screens. It is the price on the invoice. Here's the part nobody mentions. Egypt is simultaneously managing dollar scarcity, subsidy obligations it cannot easily remove for political reasons, weak import dependency, and remittance reductions, all at once. Each of these individually is a policy challenge. Simultaneously, they constitute a structural crisis. Egypt's cumulative GDP loss under current scenarios is modeled at negative 5.13% over 180 days. Kenya, Ghana, Côte d'Ivoire, Jordan. These 4 countries represent a category. 12 countries are experiencing both rising bond spreads and above-median debt payments due in 2026, including Côte d'Ivoire, Dominican Republic, Egypt, El Salvador, Ghana, Honduras, Jordan, Kenya, Mongolia, Paraguay, Rwanda, and Uzbekistan. That is not a short list. It spans 4 continents. Scholars from Nigeria, South Africa, Senegal, Kenya, and Ethiopia were asked whether the spike in oil prices was hurting their country's economy. The answer was a uniform yes. In countries with significant fuel subsidies, these pressures are intensified as higher oil prices drive up government spending. The subsidy trap is elegant in its cruelty. You subsidize fuel to protect citizens from higher prices, but the subsidy costs you more money. So you borrow more, so your debt rises, so your bond spreads widen, so your borrowing becomes more expensive. So the subsidy becomes less sustainable, so you cut it. So citizens face the price shock you were trying to avoid. This is sometimes called fiscal space exhaustion. It functions like a corridor that keeps narrowing. Jordan lost an estimated 6.35% of GDP in cumulative losses under the current scenario. Jordan has no oil and limited fiscal buffers. It imports nearly all its energy. The war is not Jordan's war. The bill is partly Jordan's bill. Here's the part nobody mentions. These countries were specifically identified by the IMF and the Boston University Global Development Policy Center as the most exposed before the war escalated. The vulnerability was mapped. The analysis existed. The assessment was accurate. The crisis happened anyway. The frontier markets. There is a category in development economics called frontier markets, countries regarded as having better growth prospects and governance track records than the average low-income country. The distinction, it turns out, was not enough. Between 2020 and 2025, frontier markets experienced more defaults than all other economies combined, according to a World Bank report released before the conflict. The distinctions that make them frontier markets may not be enough to save them from a prolonged energy crisis. The average ratio of interest expenses to government revenue for all low-income developing economies had risen above 15% as of 2025. Interest alone. Before salaries, before infrastructure, before subsidies, before anything. 15 cents of every government revenue dollar was already committed to paying interest on past debt before the oil price spike arrived. Global government debt reached 93.9% of GDP in 2025, up nearly 2 percentage points from the year prior, and was expected to reach 100% of GDP by 2029, a year earlier than previously expected. Interest payments had risen to nearly 3% of GDP in 2025, up from 2% 4 years ago. Here's the part nobody mentions. The IMF Managing Director, at the spring meetings, asked the assembled central bank governors and finance ministers to spare a thought for the Pacific Island nations, wondering whether fuel would reach them at all. The central bank governors and finance ministers gathered in Washington should also spare a thought for the looming debt crisis in developing countries brought on by the war. The IMF said this at its own meeting. The forum assembled to address it is, by its own assessment, best suited for periods of low inflation and relatively stable growth. The forum is not well suited for this. The subsidy trap and the IMF's advice. The standard policy response when your energy import costs surge is to subsidize fuel prices so citizens don't immediately feel the full shock. What was seen in the 2022 episode is that support measures were adopted, often very costly, 2 to 3% of GDP in many countries, financed by deficits, financed by debt, and often not removed as soon as the crisis had abated. The IMF's advice is not to do that this time. Rodrigo Valdez, the IMF's new fiscal affairs chief, said countries should skip fuel subsidies and opt instead for targeted, temporary cash transfers that do not obscure higher prices. We don't have oil. We don't have energy. Energy needs to be more expensive for everybody so that the adjustment happens and we consume less. This is economically coherent. It is also, in most of the countries being discussed, politically very difficult to implement. Removing a subsidy while a population is already under inflationary pressure requires a level of institutional credibility and social trust that several of these governments do not currently have. People like it when they get a subsidy or a cut in energy prices. It's politically difficult to remove them. The alternative is borrowing to fund the subsidy. The borrowing is more expensive now because bond spreads have widened. The debt rises. The IMF notices. The program conditions tighten. The subsidy becomes harder to sustain. The cycle completes. Here's the part nobody mentions. The IMF is simultaneously the source of the money, the enforcer of the conditions for getting the money, and the institution advising against the policies that would make the conditions politically survivable. This is not a conspiracy. It is a structural tension that has existed since the institution was founded. The remittance channel nobody talks about. As of March 2026, over 220,000 Indian nationals had been repatriated from the Gulf Cooperation Council region and Iran due to the escalating conflict and the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. India is one example. The Gulf employs millions of workers from South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Africa, and the Arab world. When the Gulf disrupts, the money those workers send home disrupts with it. Remittances will fall in countries that supply migrant workers to the region. For countries like Nepal, Bangladesh, the Philippines, Egypt, Jordan, and Pakistan, Remittances are not a supplemental income source. They are a structural component of the balance of payments. When Gulf economies slow, migrant workers lose income. They send less home. The receiving country's foreign exchange reserves fall. Its ability to service external debt in dollars weakens. Its currency may depreciate. That depreciation makes its dollar-denominated debt more expensive in local terms. The debt burden grows, not because of new borrowing, but because the currency moved. The war happened in March. The remittance data will show in the second quarter. The debt service data will show in the third. What happens next? The IMF's reference forecast, which assumes a short-lived conflict and a moderate 19% increase in energy commodity prices in 2026, puts global growth at only 3.1% this year and headline inflation at 4.4%, a sharp deviation from the global disinflation trend in recent years. Hardest hit are likely to be deeply indebted poorer countries that import energy and cannot afford to buffer their economies with stepped-up government spending and tax relief. No matter what happens with the blockade, the IMF is forecasting long-lasting scars in the global economy. Shipping insurance will remain high, supply chains will shift, and countries are now pricing in more geopolitical shocks in the months ahead. The countries on the list, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Egypt, Kenya, Ghana, Jordan, and a dozen others, did not start this war. They do not have armies in the region. They did not vote on the strikes or the closure or the retaliation. They are experiencing the fiscal consequences of a conflict conducted entirely by other parties, whose strategic interests do not include paying those countries' IMF bills. The term for this, in development economics, is a negative external shock. The terminology is precise. The situation is a quiet catastrophe, methodically documented in IMF briefing rooms in Washington, while the countries in question figure out which payments to defer. Salaries or default? Take your pick.